Vinit Bansal from EV Motors for his presentation, please.
My name is Vinit Bansal. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Pillai for having given us the opportunity to share our views and what we are working on in India. And I must say, Mr. Ben David, he has given a presentation that kind of leads into what we are working on. And I would like to definitely meet up with you before we end this session. A little bit background about EV Motors. We are a startup firm which was started a couple of years back. And our focus has been to look at ultra-fast charging solution for mass transportation for Indian market. Mr. Ben David had identified three key areas or three key challenges for electric mobility. First, he said cost. Second, he said range, and the third, he said charge time. So when you look at mass transportation in India, and if you were to put some constraints, some limits around that, we feel that it is possible to achieve the cost, the range, and as well as the charging time possible today in the Indian environment. So what I would like to share with you is in terms of the work that we have done so far and what we are planning to do in India as far as mass transportation and ultra-fast charging. Just to kind of give you an overview in terms of, I'm sorry? Yeah, sorry. Just to kind of give you in terms of the mass or the bus industry in India, everybody talks about the 150,000 city buses that are currently operating in India. But what about the other 1.5 million buses that are currently operating in India? There is a directive by 2030 to make it full electric, from an Indian perspective. And bus system is one which is where a lot of investment is going right now. So the question that we asked is, okay, we are looking at city buses. Well, what about the other buses? Overall, India market is roughly between 80,000 to 100,000 buses a year. Out of this, the city buses is only about 9% in terms of the vehicle population. So one needs to look at creating an infrastructure because this is a smart grid forum, so I want to talk about more on the grid side as it relates to mass transportation. So setting up or creating an infrastructure is a huge investment that is required. So the way we have looked at this is how do you create an infrastructure that will not only support the city buses or mass transportation, but also can be made available for private use, for private buses. So even though the government is providing funding right now for the city buses, but in terms of how to use that so that you get the maximum benefit out of it. So that's the thought process. And there was one study which was published or discussed at the ASRTU conference that talks about the requirement of 640,000 buses to move the people all across India. Right now, it's about 150,000. So there itself is a huge opportunity there. So how do you create the infrastructure around that, and what should be the structure of the infrastructure? So what we did was we kind of reviewed the city buses in terms of how they are structured, in terms of the distances they travel, and we kind of broke them down into three categories. One in terms of in terms of the distances traveled, in terms of the duration, and what are the various stoppages in between. And if you look at the middle line, which talks about what we found as the 80% of the buses travel between 20 to 40 kilometers one way, and there is a 10 to 15 minute stop at the end of each bus route. So the thought process was within our organization is how do you leverage or how do you design or develop a system around this phenomena, in terms of how do you set up a system. So when you talk about range, so as I said, we put a constraint of, let's say, 50 kilometer. That would kind of cover 80% of the bus routes within the city. Talking about charge time, 10 minutes or 5 to 10 minutes, there is a wait time at the end of every route. And then in terms of cost, how do you reduce the size of battery so that the cost becomes viable? And looking at this whole system as a total cost of ownership. So based around this is what we looked and proposed our solution. And that's what we are kind of working towards right now, is to build some pilots and do some prototypes in the Indian environment. So what does the ultra-fast, when I say, okay, ultra-fast solution, like 5 to 10 minute charging, what does the system would look like? So as I said, 50-kilometer range. To achieve 5-10 minute charging, you need 3C or higher charge rate, more like 4C charge rate. Also, you would like to operate the vehicles continuously with that short break, because in India, the buses operate 16 hours a day. And from a cost perspective, you want to reduce the size of the battery. So if you reduce the system to a 40-50 kilometer range, you can reduce the size of the battery to get your costs down. And the key thing is, using this system, you can have a distributed infrastructure. So what do I mean by distributed infrastructure in terms of from an Indian context? And the technology that we are proposing, ultra-fast, is already available. It's a proven technology. Yes, it is not, as the earlier speaker had said, the world is moving towards ultra-fast charging, and that's where, in terms of all the technology and development is happening to get into the faster charging time. So I was talking about what do you mean by distributed infrastructure. So I would like to use this chart to kind of outline. If you just take a look at any one Indian city, this is more of an as an example. So if you look at a 200 bus system for a particular city, city buses, I'm talking of city buses. If you look at a 200 city bus system in any city, you could actually, you would require almost about 150, 140, 150,000 chargers if you look at an overnight charging, right? You would need about, because overnight charging does take about 2 to 4 hours, so you need about 50 to 75% of your of the chargers, of the amount of buses that you have to charge the system. And generally, if you put these chargers in the bus depots, which you see on the left-hand side of your chart, talks about 4 depots where all your chargers, 140, 150 chargers, are located. First of all, with an overnight system, the private bus operators don't get access to this. The chargers are placed in the bus depot. It's available only to the city bus. So now the government is spending huge subsidy to support this infrastructure, which is limited to a particular group of people and not available to the wide group. So, and the cost of setting up such charger is the number of chargers is high. In addition to that, you also need to have substations in terms of when you look at large numbers of buses that are being operated. So you need to have substations, and there's a cost involved in terms of setting up substations. On the right-hand side, what you see is if you look at an ultra-fast charging kind of a system, you can distribute these chargers at the start and the end of every bus route. By doing that, you can have the chargers spread all across the city, and so you need less number of chargers. Plus, at the same time, since you can charge the vehicle much faster, so you're talking about a 6 to 10 minute charging, and it is available 24/7, so you can actually use one charger to charge more than 100 buses in a day, which can be accessible not only to the public, the city buses, but also accessible to private buses, because these are within the city limits. So that's the thought process in terms of how we would like to look at. However, to implement something like this, the challenges are huge in the Indian context of Indian environment. We are trying to see in terms of how to manage this process. We are a startup company, so one of the things is to look at things to really solve a problem rather than just from a commercialization perspective. So majority of the industry today is looking at overnight charging because that is one of the easiest thing to implement, which is fine. But from our perspective, because we want to bring in something new, something unique that will actually solve the investment issues that the industry or the country is working with. This is just another example in terms of, you would need something like a 3 to 10 megawatt substation if you do, like for a 200 bus system, and if you do a concentrated depot-based charging. Whereas if you work on a distributed charging, you need less than 1 megawatt, depending on what the charger rating is. So in summary, what I would like to say is that using ultra-fast charging for bus system, you can reduce the cost of the vehicle by reducing the size of the battery. You can increase the charging time. You can reduce the cost of the charging infrastructure and get better asset utilization on the charging stations. And lastly, you can also reduce the cost of the infrastructure that the grid has to put together to implement such solution. And also you get longer, you are able to get 10 years life from the battery, depending on what batteries you're using, that could meet such kind of charge rate. So, to conclude, what I would like to say is that this is, from an ultra-fast charging, is the way we think for mass transportation that India needs to seriously look at. And we are here trying to do some pilots and showcase this, how the solution would work. So thank you very much for your time.